Hello everybody, I'm George Puddy, and today I'm going to be talking about Liverpool and their terrible start to the season and sort of where they've gone wrong and how it can be fixed, because many people were saying that, it's because they've lost Mane, it's because they need a new midfielder and their midfield is too old, it's because of the injuries, and some of those issues are very irrelevant, some of them are more so relevant, but I really don't think it's a set issue of why Liverpool are perhaps not playing well, and I don't really think it's down to any one position or any one factor. There's a multitude of reasons why Liverpool haven't been playing well, and ultimately none of them, I would say, are really damning or necessarily indicate that Liverpool are going to have a really tricky season. I just think it's maybe a trickier start than they anticipated. I don't think it necessarily means that against Bournemouth at home they're still not going to score a shed load of goals and still not going to win that game, for example. I think it's a lot less drilled into the team like someone like Man United, where it's just genuine issues, and more so just perhaps a couple of surprising areas and issues that Liverpool have faced this season that I think can be sort of easily rectified, but certainly went against them in these first three games. So let's look at the Fulham game, because this in a way set the tone really for Liverpool's first three games, because lots of the issues they faced in this game really came back to hurt them in the Man United game, and it was a very damning indictment by Klopp, who is known really for sort of making excuses and not really wanting to be harsh about his team even when they haven't played well. But Jurgen Klopp essentially came out in the interview after the game and essentially said, yep, we just didn't play very well. It wasn't a very good performance, which I thought was very interesting, because that's not really something that Klopp is known for. Now, if you look at how Jurgen Klopp set up his team, it was practically the best 11 he could field, really, and I believe it was the same 11 that started in the Community Shield, which they obviously won and played very well. But for me, really, it's less sort of tactical in this game as to why Liverpool didn't play well, and it's mainly just because it's less of what they were doing and more of what Fulham were doing, because Fulham essentially came into this game with one keyword: press. They really pressed hard, they weren't giving Liverpool any time on the ball, which is what Liverpool used to do to teams, especially in Klopp's early years, and it's something that, while it's taken a backseat, is very much still a key sort of formula in how Klopp sets up his teams. He wants his midfielders to be ball winners, he wants you to not give the other team much time on the ball, and that's what Fulham sort of used against Liverpool. They used Klopp's own methodology against them, in terms of they were always on Liverpool players in the spaces, not giving them time on the ball, which meant that it was very hard for Liverpool to get the ball out of their own half. Now, many people would look at the midfield in this game and say it wasn't really working, but that's mainly just because the midfield was struggling to get passes off to the fullbacks, and the centre-backs were struggling to get passes to the midfield, and that meant that the front three became very isolated in terms of the balls just weren't coming up to them. Why this allowed Fulham and someone like Mitrovic to score on the counter-attack, bully someone like Arnold, who was slightly out of position, is because ultimately Liverpool play in such a way that the centre-back will pass it to someone like Thiago, for example, on this left-hand side. Robertson will make a run up the field and then he'll pass it to Robertson. Now, what happens if that ball from Thiago doesn't reach Robertson and is blocked by a Fulham player? That means that your left back in Andy Robertson is all of a sudden up the field, and you've lost that defensive cover, which means you're very exposed then on that left hand side, and someone like Thiago is also in the middle of the pitch, so if that gets blocked by someone like Kenny Tete, for example, and then a ball goes through, a long ball up right down the pitch into Liverpool's corner flag to someone like Bobby De Cordova-Reid, at that point Liverpool are very, very exposed, and then one ball from him up to Mitrovic, who is stronger and taller than Alexander-Arnold, can then quite easily be headed into the box. Someone like Mitrovic, I'd say, is very good in the air, but there's slight deficiencies in terms of how good he is with the ball at his feet, which is why he's never been known as a top striker, but he is lethal in the air, which is very much a game plan from Fulham. The easiest way to do this, rather than just a simple counter-attack, which in many ways it was, but rather than just setting up to defend in your own half, allowing Liverpool to have the ball until you defend one misplaced pass, and then you have the counter-attack. By pushing up and really forcing Liverpool into those mistakes, less in the forward areas and more in the midfield and the defence areas, knowing how Liverpool play with the high fullbacks. If Liverpool's high line isn't working quite as much as it has been in the past, because Liverpool's high line, it's high risk, high reward, but at the moment it's mainly just high risk, because ultimately they're not always holding the line quite as well as they have been before, so therefore teams are breaking the line a bit better, and also teams know Liverpool play this high line, so they sort of know ways to break it, if that makes sense. If Liverpool can't hold that high line, then they're being very exposed. Ultimately, Liverpool just weren't allowed much of the ball, and teams like Liverpool and Manchester City like having a lot of the ball when teams allow them to, and that's how they create their chances and dominate possession. So when you're not allowing Liverpool to have the ball, forcing them into misplaced passes in key areas, that means that you're going to find them very exposed, and if you can time your run right, then Liverpool are going to be very exposed at the back. And this is a similar thing that you saw that Newcastle did against Manchester City. High press, just not giving them time on the ball, and you could see it was something that Manchester City just weren't really comfortable with, and it wasn't something they were expecting. And that's certainly the case with Liverpool, who probably expected Fulham to set up in a similar way to how you saw Bournemouth set up against Manchester City, which is sort of 10 men behind the ball, defend for your lives. And I think this sort of became almost a false pretense that Liverpool's midfield isn't attacking enough because the balls just aren't going to the forwards. It wasn't that, it was that they couldn't get the ball to the forwards or the full backs because Fulham's pressing was just so high. And then when Fulham sort of eased off later on in the game, they got a bit more tired. Jurgen Klopp sent on someone like Darwin Núñez, who is a different type of player. Now Darwin Núñez in the Community Shield and in this game against Fulham has really excelled at being a super sub, in terms of he is a very different profile to what Liverpool have or had on the pitch against Fulham, in terms of Salah, Roberto Firmino and Luis Diaz. He's a big physical striker, bundles of pace, yes, but ultimately he can bully those defenders and you can play more crosses and long balls in, which when you're struggling to get the ball out of your own midfield, you can't pass the ball around, so sometimes you've just got to hit those long balls, which worked very, very well for Darwin Núñez. And that's how Liverpool got back into the game. They obviously didn't manage to beat Fulham, but ultimately that's where it ended in a 2-2 draw. Ultimately, it was just a performance that caught Liverpool a bit off guard. They didn't particularly play very well, and that's because Fulham really had their number. And Liverpool perhaps could have been able to combat that. It hasn't stopped them really before in the past when they've been pressed high, even though it hasn't always been that much. It's not something you've seen that much, but it has happened in the past. Liverpool haven't really struggled with that. Sort of caught Liverpool off guard really, because they weren't expecting it. Perhaps they were just a bit off the pace because it was the first game of the season, and yeah, Fulham came in with that high intensity and it caught Liverpool off guard and they really struggled. But once bringing on Núñez, they changed the game and ultimately Liverpool managed to get a point out of it. So it was something that you could sort of chalk up to Fulham coming in with a very effective game plan, Liverpool not really calling that they do that, and yeah, Fulham having their number a little bit. But Newcastle have just drawn to Manchester City. No one's saying that Manchester City are going to have a terrible season, are they? So it's sort of the odd result that you can have, but once you have a lot more of them, that becomes the issue. Now, when talking about the draw against Crystal Palace, it can really be summed up in 2 words: Darwin Núñez. Now, I feel as if we need to talk about who Darwin Núñez is and why Liverpool bought him. Now, many people are saying that Darwin Núñez is quite a clear replacement for Sadio Mane. Sadio Mane leaves Liverpool by Darwin Núñez. Sadio Mane was playing through the middle in the Champions League final. Darwin Núñez is a striker who plays down the middle now. It's a like-for-like replacement. Many of people were saying, well, Darwin Núñez isn't the same player as Sadio Mane. Darwin Núñez isn't the same profile as Sadio Mane. He's not as good as Sadio Mane. So why have Liverpool made this transfer? It's obviously going to flop. It's just bad business by Liverpool. And those people are neglecting that Darwin Núñez is not actually a replacement for Sadio Mane. Now, Sadio Mane has told Liverpool, I'd imagine a number of months ago, that he wanted to leave, possibly even before the new year. I imagine it's something that Klopp has known for a very long time, that Sadio Mane had no intention of signing a contract extension and wanted to leave Liverpool for a new challenge. Now, with that known and knowing that Sadio Mane wanted to leave at the end of the season, Jurgen Klopp and the scouting team would have identified certain players who could be effective Mane replacements, who are a similar profile to someone like Sadio Mane, who could slot into the Liverpool front three, who at that point would be joining someone like Diogo Jota in the middle with Salah on the right, which was the effective Liverpool front three for the first half of last season. Now, he's obviously identified, and the scouting team have identified, Luis Diaz of Porto as that perfect Mane replacement, and it makes sense. He's got the pace, he's got the strength. It's not the same, he's more of a classic winger than an inverted forward, but so was Sadio Mane at Southampton. These things can be moulded. No one was the exact player that Jurgen Klopp bought as they are now. Ultimately, they identified Luis Diaz as a player who they could buy in to replace Sadio Mane in the summer. However, there's one issue with this: Tottenham. So Antonio Conte has also looked at Luis Diaz as someone who can come into his front three to replace Lucas Moura. Now, at that point, Klopp's like, oh my god, if Luis Diaz goes to Tottenham in January, then obviously we're not going to be able to get him in the summer to replace Mane. So then he's got to act. He's got to buy Luis Diaz before he goes to Tottenham, which means buying him 6 months early in January, arguably when you don't really need him. So that's what happens. Liverpool beat Tottenham to the signing of Diaz. Tottenham obviously go on to sign Kulusevski instead. Missing out on Diaz didn't really hurt them. Liverpool buying Diaz in January obviously gives Klopp a bit of a dilemma. Ultimately, you've now got one more forward than perhaps you anticipated, and now you've got to try and fit him into the team. Now, I'd imagine Liverpool wanted to play Salah, Jota, Mane, but the good form of Diaz coincided with a injury for Diogo Jota, which ultimately meant that then you are having to fit Salah, Mane and Luis Diaz into one team. How does he do that? Now, he could have tried to put Luis Diaz in some false nine, because Mane has obviously been Klopp's number one presence on the left-hand side, but as a smart move, Klopp says that I need to prioritise the progress and development of Luis Diaz on this left-hand side rather than Sadio Mane, because Sadio Mane is going to be gone in 6 months. Luis Diaz is going to be playing this left-hand position for a long time. I need to prioritise bedding him in rather than giving minutes to Sadio Mane there. So ultimately, in order to get Sadio Mane into the team, because he's still one of Liverpool's best players, is that he puts Sadio Mane in the middle in the false nine role that had been occupied previously by Roberto Firmino and Diogo Jota. And it works a treat. Sadio Mane actually plays really well there, as well as obviously giving lots of minutes to Luis Diaz on the left-hand side. So then Sadio Mane leaves at the end of the season, and Klopp's got sort of the four forwards that he originally envisioned having in the summer. He has Luis Diaz, Diogo Jota, Roberto Firmino and Mohamed Salah. But in the back end of that season, I'd imagine Klopp, who is very cautious with injuries and type things you can see in press conferences and things this season, how much it really agitates him, probably really enjoyed having the rotation and the options off the bench of having 5 quality forwards. Despite that probably never really being the plan. Losing Sadio Mane and wanting 5 quality forwards, goes out and signs Darwin Núñez, someone who is very much a different profile to someone like Sadio Mane, but that's because he's not the Mane replacement. Luis Diaz is the Mane replacement, who is a very similar profile to Mane. He was always bought as the Mane replacement. Núñez really has been brought as a wild card or a different option, completely removed from the loss of Mane. Just as sort of a 5th quality forward who can come on or start and be very much a different option for Liverpool while being fresh legs and being young, and who can grow in and probably gradually replace someone like Roberto Firmino as one of your main forward options in that middle area. So knowing that Darwin Núñez was never really a replacement for Sadio Mane, let's take a look at how he plays when you actually start him in a game, rather than coming on as a super sub and using his differences to the advantages of Liverpool. How does he fit in to how Liverpool usually play when you're not trying to change the style of play tactically for some reason? Well, this is the question, because Klopp didn't really do that in the game against Crystal Palace. Ultimately, what he did was massively change up Liverpool's style of play to accompany Darwin Núñez, and this is where Liverpool really falter in this game. So Crystal Palace set up slightly different to Fulham. Rather than the constant high press, they played how most smaller teams play against Liverpool, which is sort of 10 man behind the ball, defending for your lives, and then trying to hit Liverpool on the counter-attack. Liverpool's main issue in this game was that they just changed tactically. Now, to accompany Darwin Núñez, they started playing lots of crosses and long balls, which is not what you'd associate from Liverpool at all. It's just not how they play. They have never really had a big man up top to cross balls into so he can head it or volley it or bully defenders, because someone like Klopp has sold people like Christian Benteke in the past, because that's just not how he wants his team to play. And obviously you've got people like Salah and Mane in the past, now Luis Diaz, who people would call wingers, but they're not wingers in the traditional sense. Rather than merely being creators for a big man in the middle, the man in the middle is really a creator for the wingers, who are more so inside forwards, who are going to cut it onto their other foot and cut inside and make runs into the box and score. That's what Salah's so good at. Just look at his goal against Manchester City. But with Darwin Núñez and playing crosses into the box, you had someone like Alexander-Arnold and Robertson, who are obviously doing their usual runs at the top of the pitch and crossing balls in. But also you weren't having Salah and Diaz in the penalty box really, or making those runs into the penalty box, because it was very much playing old-fashioned target man football, doing a long ball into Núñez and he should score. So therefore that's why Salah and Diaz were really isolated and just not really in the game at all, because they were playing very wide on the sort of near the corner flag, almost overlapping with someone like Alexander-Arnold or Robertson. They were very much sort of in the same sort of zone. Diaz and Salah weren't taking up their usual positions, slightly more inverted. Now this meant that Salah and Diaz obviously weren't really in the game, and that meant you almost had sort of two useless players who are not wingers, and they're not going to be able to get crosses into the box, at least not to a very good level. And obviously if you're having your fullbacks pushing up and doing the crosses purely to Darwin Núñez, then ultimately it renders Salah and Diaz stuck out on wide very, very useless, which meant that Liverpool were almost playing with sort of 9 players rather than 11. And when doing this, when requiring Alexander-Arnold and Robertson to be up the pitch constantly to make crosses, that's going to leave Liverpool a bit exposed as well, especially when playing someone like Harvey Elliott on the right hand side, who put in a shift and a very good performance ultimately, but he's not as solid as someone like Henderson. He's going to push a little bit further up, he's not going to drift into that space to cover Arnold, and that meant that, as well as having someone like Phillips, who I think is a good defender, but he's not the paciest and he's not as used to playing that high line or playing with the other players, and that meant that one ball over the top, past Elliott, past Arnold, and past Nat Phillips, could go to Wilfried Zaha, and he scores that first goal. And obviously with Salah and Diaz being so wide, and then obviously we know the outside of Liverpool's midfielders also drift wide to cover the spaces, that ultimately means that Liverpool are left very threadbare in the centre and centrally, which means that that's a lot of work for Fabinho, and he didn't have a particularly good game. He's looked quite lightweight, a bit off the pace in the Fulham and Crystal Palace games. He hasn't looked at his best, and obviously Fabinho is so key defending centrally to this Liverpool system, so he was sort of left a bit exposed there because Liverpool were playing so wide, unusually for Liverpool. Now, I sort of criticised Liverpool in this game for sort of ditching their known tactics, which relies on someone like Salah and the left-sided player, in this case Diaz, for essentially maybe regressing or just going in a different direction to playing long ball target man football, but it is obviously a philosophy that can work. It's something that worked for Darwin Núñez at Benfica, and it's something that works for a multitude of clubs. So even though you are sort of neglecting the talents of Salah and Diaz, the tactics should still work, because putting world-renowned crosses in two of the best fullbacks at doing that in the world to a big man in Darwin Núñez should work. But the problem is when you're putting Salah and Diaz out of the game and you're purely focusing all your balls to cater to someone like Darwin Núñez, then the one man who all your chances are going to needs to actually score. And that was an issue as well. It's not just changing the tactics to suit Núñez, at the expense of Salah and Diaz. It's that when doing that, obviously Núñez has to be really clinical and has to score some of his chances, which ultimately he didn't do. He was incredibly unclinical in this game. His finishing just doesn't seem to be there yet. He seems to scuff some chances. He doesn't perhaps have the confidence yet, which is a little bit worrying, considering I thought that Community Shield win would really push him on to find that confidence. He doesn't seem to yet. He gets sent off. Liverpool are losing at this point to Crystal Palace, and people are like, oh, it can't go better for Liverpool now because they're down to 10 men. But it sort of did, because ultimately Liverpool were almost down to 9 men because Salah and Diaz just weren't in the game because they don't work in the system. So ultimately, you take Núñez out, the play reverts to type. You've almost gained an extra man because Salah replaces Núñez, and you've almost gained a player in Diaz in that sense, which is why Liverpool played better after going down to 10 men and equalised in a brilliant bit of magic from someone like Luis Diaz. But yeah, it's odd really in terms of this game hinged on Darwin Núñez. Liverpool completely changed tactically to fit in Darwin Núñez, and it sacrificed other players in the process, left Liverpool a bit exposed, and obviously that does happen but can be countered by the tactics working down at the other end. What you're sacrificing can be countered by what you're gaining, but ultimately you weren't gaining much because Núñez, while it being focused all through him, wasn't scoring the chances. So different problems really to where Liverpool went wrong in the Fulham game. That game was very much Liverpool's known style being countered by Fulham using their own philosophy against them. This game was Liverpool completely changing tactics, sacrificing elements of their old style to do something new, and that something new being Darwin Núñez just not really taking his chances, which this sort of new tactical approach that Klopp was using really thrives upon and sort of relies upon. So that's where they drew against Crystal Palace, different to how they drew against Fulham, but ultimately there's still some very clear issues, as well as sort of Darwin Núñez working very well as a super sub, but not perhaps working all too well when you're playing him from the start. But that's not an issue Liverpool needed to have against Manchester United, because he went and got himself suspended for 3 games. So then we get the Man United game, which Liverpool didn't draw, they lost 2-1. Now I had a feeling this would be a difficult game. It was sort of a free hit for Erik ten Hag. He had everything to gain and nothing to really lose, and obviously he could set up in a very different way to how he would against Brentford and Brighton in the 2 games he lost. In terms of in those games he had to play on the front foot. In this game he could very much be the smaller team, and Liverpool had to control the game, which means he could play slightly differently in order to get the win, and his principles weren't really tested. And I was always a bit worried because everyone was sort of going into the game saying, oh yeah, Liverpool win this easy, and I was like, I just have a feeling this won't be the case because Liverpool haven't been that great. And they lost the game. I was expecting a draw, I'm going to be honest, a first excessive draw. They didn't, they lost the game. And this is down to some odd selection issues by Klopp, and some odd attitude issues, I think, that are actually very worrying. This is easily the most worrying game for Liverpool so far, not just because it's the only loss, but ultimately in those other 2 games Liverpool did concede the first goal, they did go behind, but they managed to get back in the game and at least get a point from it. That's something that Liverpool didn't do against Man United and never really looked like they would ever do. Yes, they scored a goal, but that was after United had already scored 2, leaving them very little time to get a second, and it never really looked like they'd get a second. It was more of a consolation goal than anything really substantial. And Man United absolutely deserved the win. In the Crystal Palace game, Liverpool were the better team, but they just couldn't really score the goals due to the odd tactical setup, as I said, but they did dominate possession, they did create the more chances, they just struggled to put the ball in the back of the net. But against Man United, they weren't the better team at all. Man United set up in a very similar way against Fulham, starting off fast on the break and, pressing Liverpool, not giving them time on the ball. And again, Liverpool couldn't really cope with that. Klopp made some odd selections in this game. In place of Phillips, he had Joe Gomez. Now, Joe Gomez is a better defender than Nathaniel Phillips, and you must not forget, Liverpool essentially won the league with Joe Gomez and Van Dijk being the preferred centre-back pairing for most of that season. So Joe Gomez isn't a bad defender, nor is he bad when paired with Virgil van Dijk. But you've got to remember, Joe Gomez spent some of last season injured, a lot of last season playing right back, and ultimately he just hasn't played centre back with Virgil van Dijk all that much recently. So ultimately, there is going to be perhaps some teething issues in terms of their relationship, because they're just going to be a bit rusty naturally. And you did see that in terms of the space between Gomez and Van Dijk is not something that should really be happening. They should be a lot closer together. And that's all because really Joe Gomez is the fourth choice centre-back, a very good fourth choice centre-back who was once first choice and is only fourth choice because of injuries really. But the lack of playing time in the last couple of years between those two meant that they were a bit of a rusty pairing. The midfield is the very contentious issue. He played Elliott on the right once again, as he did in the Palace game. However, Milner retains his position on the left, but Henderson drops into the Fabinho role, leaving Fabinho on the bench. This is very odd to me, I thought, because Fabinho is easily your best ball-winning midfielder. He's one of the best players in the world at playing that defensive midfielder role. So unless it's an injury, why are you leaving him out in such a big game? Jordan Henderson can do it, but he's better on the right, but that's not to say he can't do it. He's done it before, he does it quite well. But in my opinion, you can't play both Jordan Henderson and James Milner in the same midfield, not in a big game anyway. They've played it before. I mean, they played it against Newcastle last season, and obviously they won that game. It's not a massive issue in a smaller game, but in a big game I think it's a massive issue because they're both just not the paciest customers. They're both quite slow. Obviously Milner doesn't have the legs anymore, and Henderson is getting on as well, so they don't have the legs of someone like Fabinho, and that means that obviously these players can be caught out with pace, and if they make a slapdash pass, they're not going to have the legs to make the runs back. Or if they are caught up the field like James Milner was, he was pushing way too far up in this game, oddly enough, then ultimately they're not going to have the legs to come back and cover. So that was an issue in this game. I don't really know why Klopp left Fabinho out. He said that it was to rest him because he worries that with all the injuries going on he could get another injury, so he wants to rotate the few midfielders that he has. But just don't play him against Bournemouth. Play James Milner against Bournemouth. In my opinion, you've got to start your best midfielders if they are available in this game, and ultimately he didn't do that, and I think it cost Liverpool in a way. Also, Jordan Henderson didn't look fully fit. I'm going to be honest, he looked slow. He just didn't really seem comfortable in the game, and he was substituted relatively early on, 50 minutes in for Fabinho, even though it would make a lot of sense to substitute James Milner. And because Klopp did that, Milner played 72 minutes. I'd say that Henderson perhaps wasn't fully fit. Then obviously a front three of Salah, Diaz and Roberto Firmino, who also wasn't fully fit. He'd come back from injury, probably rushed back into the team, but ultimately with Jota injured and Nunez being suspended, ultimately what other choice did Klopp have? So ultimately it's a team that has frailties in the midfield, but it's still a team that should be able to beat Manchester United. But again, United used the speed, the high press. That just caught Liverpool out straight from the off. Liverpool once again having the issues of struggling to get the ball, especially in the first sort of 20 minutes out of their own half. And after the United first goal, United obviously eased off as to not use up all their energy, gave Liverpool more of the ball, and yeah, this should have been when Liverpool should have got back into the game. And they did have a spell just before half-time, and this sort of 5 minutes before United's second goal after the second half, in which they dominated the game and created a decent amount of chances. However, the one issue is that Liverpool while having lots of possession. I think they had about 78% possession, which is a ridiculous amount, and while sort of having lots of opportunities in the box, they never really created any clear-cut chances from my memory, literally, other than the goal and one Henderson chance before the end of the first half, and one Roberto Firmino chance that was the save by David De Gea literally right at the end of the game. They didn't create that much chances despite having the ball, and that's because ultimately the United defenders were just heading out every single ball that went into the box. Every single corner, every single cross, every single ball was instantly stopped by a Man United defender, because Liverpool's passing, blocked or not, because Fulham were putting pressure on Liverpool, United were at certain instances, but they weren't really, in this case, in terms of when they eased off. It was just sort of poor play, but the balls were just weren't great, and the passing was just quite weak. I don't know whether that's because certain players are just unfit, but yeah, certain balls just weren't going to Salah and Diaz. They were very much kind of invisible again, but that's not because of tactics. That's just because the balls just weren't necessarily getting to them. And as I said, that's not because of pressures, that's just because the balls were crap. Honestly, Roberto Firmino, serious questions I think need to be asked of him. Obviously, I can cut him a little bit of slack because he obviously wasn't fully fit. He was thrust into this game, but his passing has been very poor, and very poor for a while. He's never had the goal record, really, but he did score a lot more goals than he does now, and even when that has dried up, you say, well, he still links the play very well. His passing is better than anyone else Liverpool has in those forward positions, but it doesn't seem to anymore. I can't really remember a pass that he made that was successful, really. He's not only making bad passes that aren't going to the man, but for some very odd passing choices, like when he sort of scooped a ball up to try and pass to James Milner, which I like, why was he trying that? It was obviously not going to go to him, and that's not what he should have done in that position whatsoever. So yeah, he wasn't linking the play really to Salah or Luis Diaz, and Salah and Luis Diaz never really had any clear-cut chances. You were also getting lots of sort of low XG shots, like Harvey Elliott just shooting from sort of outside the box in a shot that was never going to go in. Like, I like Harvey Elliott. Again, he put in a shift in this game, but his shots that were just sort of pot shots that weren't really going in. And after the second goal, ultimately, Liverpool seemed like they gave up, which is a massive worry, and the most worrying thing out of this entire video. Liverpool was strolling the ball around without any urgency, as if they were 5-0 down. Not only 2-0 down to a struggling United with 30 minutes to play, and you've seen someone like Manchester City get back in a game. You had to see it against Newcastle. Liverpool did not look like they were. Their heads were down, the body language was very worrying, and they were putting balls into the box, but with no real conviction. They had lots of touches in Man United's box, but with no real sense that any real clear-cut chances were being created. In the first half, you had a bust-up between James Milner and Virgil van Dijk arguing. That's not something you've really seen from Liverpool. Discontent in the ranks. It's something that Liverpool have really been the opposite of. A main point of Liverpool has been the harmonious dressing room, everyone on the same page. And the fact that that's just not the case now, for the first time ever, is quite worrying, really. And yeah, this team looked leggy, they look tired, and this has sort of come on to one of my issues with Liverpool, is they look like they played 60 games. It doesn't look like it's the start of the season, and I think that can maybe be pinpointed to Klopp's weird decisions in pre-season, in terms of, if you were watching Liverpool in pre-season, you would know that Klopp regularly rotated the lineup in a pre-season game 3 times, so players would play for 30 minutes, then subbed off. The issue with that is you're never getting any rhythm in the game, or players are not really playing with each other. You're not playing a settled team, you're playing loads of youth players and under 21 players who are never going to be part of the Liverpool first team. You're giving them minutes, and prioritising giving them minutes rather than giving longer minutes to the settled first team and really allowing them to gel. So that means that you're seeing a Liverpool team that don't look like they've gelled. It looks like a Liverpool team that aren't fully connected and don't really know what each other are doing. They look like a Liverpool team that haven't had a rest because they haven't been able to play lots of games together in pre-season and really, come together and sort out a tactical plan. And I think ultimately that's really made Liverpool struggle, especially when looking at some defensive areas and midfield areas in terms of how many games did Henderson and Milner play in pre-season together, how many times did Gomez and Van Dijk play together in pre-season, how many times did Núñez actually play with Salah and Diaz in pre-season rather than playing with perhaps someone like Carvalho and Elliott in a front three, whereas they're going to be more traditional wingers than someone like Salah. So it seems as if Klopp has sort of shot himself in the foot with the ridiculous rotation. Yes, you have the injuries, which means you have less rotation, lots of midfield injuries. I don't think that necessarily means, though, that Liverpool need to buy a midfielder, or not the midfielders people are talking about. I think if they were to buy a midfielder, it would have to be a defensive one to ease the pressure of having to play Henderson and Milner in the same team. But you don't need many attacking midfielders, because as I mentioned in the Jude Bellingham video, they've got a long list of those. They just happen to all be injured at the moment. But what happens when they're all fit again and then you've got too many players? You need to sell before you can buy, really, or buy with the intention of selling. And Liverpool obviously aren't going to be able to sell players if they're injured, so they're not going to buy. One thing that could have changed this game is Núñez coming off the bench. Obviously, he could have started, but he's looked a lot better as a super sub. Perhaps he could have come on, bullied someone like Lisandro Martinez, made Liverpool have a different approach. It was a very poor showing from Liverpool, and yeah, questions do have to be asked. I think the mentality in them looking like they've given up the body language was the most worrying thing, and Klopp not really getting the selection or tactics right in any of these first three games is a bit of an issue, considering Klopp's been a tactical genius for most of his reign at Liverpool. For him to sort of be consistently getting these things wrong, I'd say is quite worrying ultimately. Liverpool do seem to be getting a bit exposed, but ultimately I do think that these are three games in which in two of them, they've been pressed quite substantially, meaning they can't really play their normal game. And then against Crystal Palace, Liverpool chose to not play their normal game and thread balls in and rely on a striker who just wasn't clinical. So those issues, I would say, aren't really going to come up, especially with Núñez's suspension in the next few games. I don't think this is the end for Liverpool, the end of them being title challengers. I just think they did face some very particular issues in these three games, and they've got some very particular issues at the moment that won't last for the full season. There are some more issues that seemed a bit more ingrained, like the discontents, the mentality that Klopp needs to sort out, but ultimately the injuries won't last in the whole season. They won't face teams that are going to constantly press them throughout the whole season. And yeah, ultimately the worry is that, yeah, you may pick up later on in the season, but will you be too far behind Manchester City at that point? Potentially. They lost Mane and injuries, and they need a midfielder. Those are, in my opinion, very lazy reasons as to why it's not going well for Liverpool. There's actually some more nuanced reasons, and lots of them, but they're not ones that I think mean that Liverpool have a damning season. It just means that they've had a damning start. So yes, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like and drop a sub below if you want to see more football content from me on Liverpool and many other teams as well. I'm currently thinking of making a video on Arsenal and why I'm such a big fan of them, as well as doing a bit more of an in-depth dive on why I think Nottingham Forest's heavy spending will get them relegated. So if you want to see those videos, make sure to, subscribe. And yeah, ultimately, what do you think of this video? Do you agree with me? Do you completely disagree? What would be your solutions to trying to help Liverpool get out of this dodgy patch of form and excel to the levels we know they can reach? Whatever you think, drop your thoughts in the comment section below. I'd be really interested to read your thoughts. But yes, thank you guys for watching, and of course, a goodbye.